Good afternoon, 8th grade. It is Monday, April 20th. This is your American history class. Today we're going to be reading pages 354 to 358 and doing the section review on page 358, odd number only. Glad you could join us. We're in a new chapter. We're in chapter 22, Troubled Times for America. This chapter is going to be tackling some issues that America deals with, not just wartime and military issues, but issues with theology and religion. At this time in America, we're facing challenges to our Christian foundation. The humanist movement, where humans are basically equal to God. In fact, humanists would say that humans created God. This is a movement that's going on at this time in history. And we're on 22.1, Testing Traditional Values. We're going to begin. We're going to look at fruits of humanism in America. By the early 1960s, the teachings of humanist philosopher John Dewey, the father of progressive education, had permeated or poured through public education. Dewey was a leader in the secular humanist movement. Secular means non-religious, which put man in place of or above God. Moral absolutes, such as those once taught in McGuffey's Readers, were replaced by humanistic ideas, such as encouraging children to follow their animal instincts and to practice permissive self-expression in the classroom. Now we're going to look at O'Hare's campaign against God. In 1962, the Supreme Court removed prayer from public schools, and in 1963, it banned Bible reading from the public schools. These decisions came about largely through the efforts of Madalyn Murray O'Hare, an atheist, one who does not believe in God, and communist, who used her teenage son, William, to protest daily Bible reading and prayer in the public schools of Baltimore, Maryland. A liberal Supreme Court ruled that even voluntary Bible reading and prayer were unconstitutional because they discriminated against non-Christians. The founding fathers who wrote the Constitution had great respect for both prayer and God's Word. It was because of our Christian heritage that most schools had included the prayer and Bible reading in their daily routine for years. The Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution in a way that its writers would not have agreed with. O'Hare's son, William Murray, wrote a letter to a Baltimore newspaper in 1980 apologizing for his role in the removal of Bible reading and prayer from public schools. He said that his mother had brainwashed him into accepting atheism and communism, but after years of misery and despair, he had found faith in God. Now, he prayed that God might somehow use his testimony to bring prayer back into the classroom. And as a result of this lack of God in the classroom, we have a moral decline throughout the country. As progressive educators removed godly values from the classroom, America's youth became ripe for the spirit of rebellion that moved across the nation in the late 1960s, opening the door to drug abuse and sexual immorality. As discipline, dress codes, and moral standards relaxed in the public school systems, test scores continue to decline. In response to the declining moral and academic standards in the public schools, many parents enrolled their children in private Christian schools. Many Christian schools were started in the 1960s. Now let's learn about the ACLU. Since the 1920s, a group of lawyers known as the American Civil Liberties Union had actively defended the extreme views of atheist, socialist, and communist minorities. In the 1960s, the ACLU began to use the courts to force local communities to stop making references to biblical values in public life. They claimed that the U.S. Constitution established a wall of separation between church and state. Later, the ACLU had bronze copies of the Ten Commandments removed from walls in schools, village halls, and county courthouses, and forced some communities to ban public Christmas displays featuring the birth of Jesus. Now let's learn about President Johnson and the Great Society. In the presidential election of 1964, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas ran against Senator Barry M. Goldwater, a conservative from Arizona. Goldwater opposed big government and urged a return to a constitutional system of limited government. However, because the nation still mourned Kennedy's death, Johnson won the election by promising to continue the programs of the late president. LBJ lacked Kennedy's charm, but he was able to push many social welfare programs through Congress. President Johnson called his program the Great Society. FDR's New Deal, JFK's New Frontier, and LBJ's Great Society led to larger and larger social welfare programs, making the United States, in essence, a welfare state. The Great Society became the largest public welfare program since the New Deal. As state and local governments accepted tax dollars from the federal government for new welfare programs, they surrendered most of their authority to Washington, D.C. For the first time, local school districts accepted money from the federal government. Great Society programs included the Job Corps, Head Start, and Medicare, which provided health care. The civil rights movement continues. The Great Society focused heavily on civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination in public places. Some states did not permit people to vote unless they paid a poll tax or fee to vote, which many black people could not afford. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, banned the poll tax. The Voting Rights Acts of 1965 required federal supervision of local elections. The number of black people registered to vote increased by 40%. As part of the Great Society program, President LBJ created a new cabinet position, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, which poured large amounts of money into inner cities to improve housing and living conditions. Robert Weaver became the first black American cabinet officer as the head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. President Johnson also appointed the first black associate justice of the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. As a young lawyer, Marshall argued the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case before the Supreme Court. In the 1960s, blacks and Hispanics were finding it hard to purchase homes based on their ethnicity. Frustration from those living in the inner city sections with poor living conditions, gangs, and crimes led to a series of riots. The area of Watts in Los Angeles erupted with violence in 1965, and Detroit saw fires and looting in the summer of 1967. Congress responded by passing the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which prohibited discrimination in renting or selling houses based on race, religion, and other factors. Despite the good intentions of these laws, many problems remained. During the Civil Rights Movement, many Southerners resented federal officials telling their state and local governments what to do. Most black and white Southerners had long lived together in harmony. They had been taught to accept segregation as a way of life. However, some people in both the North and South took the law into their own hands. A few belonged to white supremacist groups like the KKK, and a few belonged to black supremacist organizations. The most prominent black supremacist leader of the 1960s was Malcolm X, who considered Martin Luther King Jr.'s methods too peaceful and slow. Malcolm X wanted to assert what he called black power, calling for the segregation or complete separation of the races to preserve black culture. Radicals like Malcolm X stood in direct opposition to Martin Luther, who supported desegregation or integration of the races. In 1965, rival black Muslim leaders hired gunmen who murdered Malcolm X. As time went by, many people forgot that Malcolm X had supported violence and racial separation, and he became a symbol of black pride. Now let's look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. Of all the black leaders in the civil rights movement, none has matched the stature of Martin Luther King Jr. in people's minds. King insisted on nonviolent demonstrations to end discrimination. He once said, "Don't let anyone pull you so low as to hate them." Although many black Americans supported what he stood for, communism and other radical ideas hurt the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings that people should break the law in nonviolent ways to bring about change opened the door to other kinds of law breaking. When power-hungry individuals stirred up the people, riots terrorized black neighborhoods in the late 1960s, and in 1968, while on a visit to Memphis, Tennessee, MLK Jr. is assassinated by a gunman who used the violent atmosphere to justify his own racism. Today, people of all ethnic groups are striving to realize MLK Jr.'s dream that people be judged by their character rather than by their skin. It is a dream shared by all Americans of goodwill, and is according to Romans 2:11, for there is no respect of persons with God. Now let's talk about the Vietnam War. While JFK was still president, the United States had begun sending soldiers to the southeast nation of South Vietnam. The communist leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, with the help of the Soviets and the Chinese, had begun a guerrilla war against the people of South Vietnam. In guerrilla warfare, rather than soldiers meeting on a battlefield, it was blitz tactics, ambush tactics. They'd show up, attack and kill people, and then vanish back into the woods. Concerned Americans believed in the domino theory of communism that if one country fell to communism, other countries surrounding it would fall like dominoes, one by one by one by one. President Eisenhower had first used this term while referring to Southeast Asia. South Vietnam was the first domino, and the communists were trying to knock it over. If South Vietnam fell, then Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Burma, Indonesia, they would all fall too. These lesser developed nations were known as Third World. Now let's learn about the Gulf of Tonkin. Communist guerrillas called Viet Cong terrorized the innocent South Vietnamese villagers, forcing men, women, and children to help them. The Viet Cong sometimes equipped little children with explosives and sent them on suicide missions to American soldiers. In fact, American soldiers recounted the terror of village meetings because some of them would have to gun down little children because they had the bombs and the soldiers saw the bombs and they did not want their own men to die. It was terrible and it cost many lives, but that was the tragedy and realism of the Vietnam War. It was not a pretty war. In 1964, though, the North Vietnamese Navy allegedly attacked American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson used this incident to obtain permission from Congress to increase his military presence in South Vietnam, which would put the United States directly at war with North Vietnam. President Johnson wanted to fight the communists in South Vietnam, but Congress refused to allow American forces to take the offensive. Congress opposed a clear military victory, and the president himself wavered in his commitment because he did not want military spending to interfere with his social welfare programs. Under President Johnson, the United States sent some 500,000 American troops to South Vietnam to defend freedom in a no-win conflict known as the Vietnam War. Though these men fought bravely, remember, Congress is in charge of the purse strings, and ultimately Congress let the people down. Congress's refusal to allow the American military to take an offensive position rather than defensive caused us to basically have to retreat. We had this series of defensive battles known as the Tet Offensive. And as Americans and South Vietnamese troops suffered heavy casualties, it became clear that unless we took the offensive, North Vietnam was going to win. But the war wasn't popular with the people. And the Congress, remember, they're elected by the people. So rather than fight a war that would make them unpopular, they chose to hold back. And patriotism hit an all-time low during this war. Veterans of the Vietnam War were welcomed back with tomatoes and eggs pelted at them, booze, cursing, all sorts of terrible things you would never want to do towards soldiers. Many college students dodged the draft, and professors at colleges talked about how terrible these people were who fought in the Vietnam War. Rebellion, protest, and rock music. As the war in Vietnam dragged on, college campuses were plagued with riots, war protests, flag burnings, and other anti-American activities. Some young men, as I said, dodged the draft and even fled to Canada. Many young people turned to drugs and immoral lifestyles. These youth became known as hippies. They went without bathing, wore dirty, raggy, unconventional clothing, and deliberately broke all codes of politeness or manners. Rock music played an important part in the hippie movement and had great influence over the hippies. Many of the rock musicians they followed belonged to Eastern religious cults or practiced Satan worship. And that pretty much concludes the end of 22.1. There's a little bit I didn't read at the very end, but make sure you cover all that. I read most of it today, but make sure you get that last page and a half or so. But with that, make sure that you read this little section on page 358 about Chappie James, a Vietnam War hero, and do the odd numbers only on section 22.1. Hope you guys have a great Monday. I'll see you soon.